Hey everybody, welcome to the next edition of our school's lecture series, the Robert B. Church Memorial Lecture Series. This is our third lecture of the spring term and our seventh of the year by my count, in a series that I think just keeps delivering one high-end offering after another. I want to say thanks to everybody for coming tonight. This is at work. We're co-sponsoring with TAST for the event tonight. And I think the lectures have been super well attended, and I'm very glad and happy with the energy about it, both from students and faculty. So I just want to say thanks to everybody for that. Okay, joining us tonight is Nicholas de Monchaux. Nicholas is an associate professor of architecture and urban design at the University of California, Berkeley. He's a fellow of the American Academy in Rome. And at the MacDowell Colony, has received additional design awards and fellowships, et cetera, from Parsons, the International Union of Architects, Pamphlet Architecture, and the Van Allen Institute. He's a winner of the Eugene M. Award from the American Astronautical Society. I like that one especially. And shortlisted for the Art Book Prize. His work has been exhibited at the 2010 Biennale of the Americas, the 2012 Venice Biennale of Architecture, and San Francisco's SF MoMA. Nicholas is a producer, I think, of many varied types of work. He's a writer, a maker, a drawer, a diagrammer, a historian, and in my opinion, a prolific researcher. But if we try to describe him most accurately in a way that captured all those various modes, I think most of all we can admire Nicholas as a design theorist. He's someone who values the making of things as much as the writing and saying of them, in order to produce new ways of knowing things that perhaps we've always looked at but never truly seen. Such is the case for me in his book, Spacesuit, Fashioning Apollo, published in 2011 from MIT Press, which I admiringly describe as a category killer. In it, Nicholas describes the crafting of the Apollo-era spacesuit, but in a way that captures not only the materials and logistics of making it, but in all its other extensive reasons for being. Things like couture fashion movements, cyborgs, cybernetic logics, image culture of the 1960s, etc. Nicholas's second and most recently released book is Local Code, 3,659 proposals about data, design, and the nature of cities, from Princeton Architectural Press in 2016. Here again, Nicholas weaves together so many disparate histories and ways of seeing objects, architectures, and landscapes and cities. Here the object of study is not an object per se, but it's the city and cityness itself. It's part, I think, techno-material culture, part design history reread, part speculative projection about the future of cities and their digital citizenship. Nicholas's theses in both books, as well as his larger body of work and research, emanate out of what I would describe as a gathering and collecting, an assemblage of narratives, case studies, histories, archival discoveries, and disciplinary probes. In preparing this introduction tonight, I was trying to come up with a joke about J.B. Jackson, Jane Jacobs, and Rainer Banham walking into a bar. But I soon realized that it wouldn't make any sense until after Nicholas's lecture, partly because it just wouldn't have made a very good joke, but secondly and mostly because it's impossible to properly reproduce the effects, I think, of Nicholas's work in this limited space. He's a brilliant writer, and his particular style produces connections that none of the rest of us knew anything about, in a type of what we might call emergent theory that spills out as you're reading or listening to it. So I think we'll just leave it to him. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Nicholas.
Thanks very much. That was a really wonderfully flattering introduction, and I will try and do it justice. While this first slide is up, I would position what I'm going to talk to you about this evening relative to two different kinds of politics. The first kind of politics is the most important politics these days, which is the politics of our nation as a whole. We are in a unprecedented moment in American political history, and one of the proclamations from our current president that has not yet been met as part of the rollout of a set of very tendentious policies in the last month is a promised $1.2 to $1.9 trillion infrastructural investment plan. And so I think I will talk to you very much tonight around the question of what infrastructure actually means in cities and landscapes. This is, of course, a really important and interesting thing to be thinking about here specifically, not just anywhere in the world, but in Tennessee, the home of a historic set of national investments in infrastructure throughout the 20th century, and home of the kinds of things that this infrastructure plan that we are promised from the current administration will contain. Big things: bridges, roads, tunnels, identifiable things, things with big shapes and boundaries on the horizon. I'm going to talk to you tonight about a different kind of infrastructure, a kind of infrastructure that may be even or more necessary to the growth and resilience of our communities. But I'll let that go for the moment and explain it with starting with the next slide. The other kind of politics I would ask you to think a little bit about are the politics of a place like this one, of a school of architecture, of what it means to be an architect in the 21st century, and in particular about the larger separation through specialization that has guided our discipline throughout the 20th and 21st century. When Alberti set out the nature of the modern architectural profession in his book De Re Edificatoria, I think it was the second book, I don't know the reference for sure, but he said that to be an architect was to specialize in three things, was to do three things: to make buildings, to make and structures and landscapes, to craft improvements, technical improvements around the making of buildings and landscapes, and lastly, to engage and understand the history of the making and building of landscapes. For him, that was the three-legged stool of what it meant to be an architect, along with a much larger trend towards specialization in the modern world. People these days tend to do one or the other. They tend to either focus on making things or focus on the technical matters of making things, or focus on the history of things. And I guess the way in which I will present my work to you is my own assertion, possibly against the tide of history, that it is ever more important to do all of these things together and to bring them together in our profession. So that's what I will attempt to model in miniature for you in the context of this lecture is a very deeply held belief of mine about what is really important in our profession and what the greatest potential of our profession is. This lecture starts with some tiny little things. 11 small microscopic parcels of New York City real estate assembled by the architecturally trained artist Gordon Matta-Clark between 1971 and 1973 through attending land auctions and paging through reams of sort of telephone book style property rosters to find these abandoned spaces in New York City. Today, using a modern geographic information system, it's possible to find many thousands of sites like this in New York City, and in fact, in almost any American city we care to look at. This is 1,500 sites in San Francisco, sites in Boston, New Orleans, Miami. The presence of empty and abandoned spaces is, if nothing else, a kind of constant, a sine qua non of the American urban landscape. Starting in 2009 with students at Berkeley, I started to look at these spaces, in particular a database of 1,500 so-called unaccepted streets. Unaccepted because the city's Department of Public Works would agree with you that these were zoned as streets, but they would contest the fact that they were actually used as rights-of-way, and thus they didn't maintain them. And database is maybe too grand a word. In fact, this was a single Excel spreadsheet that I wrangled out of an administrative assistant in the call center of the Department of Public Works, and the Excel spreadsheet was only kept so that when people called to complain that there was like a burning couch in one of these streets, that they could say, oh no, that's an unaccepted street. We don't maintain it. But because of my interest in Matta-Clark, because of my interest in the kind of metabolism of emptiness and vacancy in cities, I got a hold of this, and my students and I did some of the first surveys and actual maps of these sites in San Francisco. So not only are these sites interesting for their existence, but they turn out to be particularly interesting when you look at other kinds of urban information. They tend to track very closely, for example, the sort of respiratory hazards and ailments, carcinogens in the city. They track reported crime, which is always different from actual crime, but a good indicator. And they, in fact, score very highly on a whole range of social needs indicators used by planners. Something else is true of these sites. They tend to track very closely environmental issues in the city, from the urban heat island to particularly true in San Francisco during flooding like this year's stormwater impediments. They track the concentration of heavy particulates in the air, and thus, perversely, these abandoned spaces are some of the potentially most valuable for not only ecological and infrastructural work, but also towards a kind of economic and potentially a kind of economic and social resilience as well. My fundamental argument to tonight is about how we think about infrastructure. Mostly, we think about infrastructure in the United States in terms of big things that have predictable effects on landscapes. But if you really think about the challenges we face from the unexpected effects of climate change on buildings and landscapes, increased drought, increased flood, increased likelihood of extreme weather events, the real problem is what the Rockefeller Foundation has termed resilience, which is kind of a stupid word, because resilience just means the tendency of a spring to go back to where it was before, whereas in fact what we need is a kind of adaptability, an ability to continue to transform and change. But when you think about resilience, the problem with the enormous kinds of infrastructural investments that you have even here in your landscape is that even a 1,000-foot dam is useless against a flood that's 1,000 feet and 1 inch tall. Right? That large infrastructural infrastructural investments tend to be by their very nature brittle and poorly adapted to extreme circumstances. The work that I'm presenting here is a proposal about another way of thinking about infrastructure, because one of the reasons why we've historically done big measurable things is because our computation, our ability to understand the landscape has been limited to what those big things can do. But in this day and age, when we can map and understand the city as a complex network of influences and watersheds and small-scale environmental impacts, we can predict and therefore invest in a different kind of change in urban landscapes, a change that might take, say, an investment like the recent multi-billion-dollar investment in higher diameter sewer pipes in San Francisco, and instead take even a fraction of those funds, or half of those funds, as is shown here, and make a series of targeted micro-investments in all these vacant sites, which would accomplish at lower cost, at about half the cost, exactly the same goal of shaving off the top of the flood when it hits the San Francisco sewer system, and do so, not incidentally, not by putting money underground, but by putting money on the surface of the city's most at-risk and underserved neighborhoods, communities of color, and those not usually getting the kinds of investments that we're talking about. A stormwater retention, a localized stormwater retention infrastructure in each one of these sites that were outlined here would, at half the cost of underground sewer improvements, net you a local investment of about $600 a square foot in each of these, which is a lot of park and a lot of landscape, still at less of the cost, mostly because infrastructure is really, really expensive. Okay, so since starting this project in San Francisco in 2009, my students and my studio have done consulting work and collaborations in several other cities, in Los Angeles and in New York City, LA, collaborating with a community nonprofit called the Amigos de los Rios, and in New York City with an urban ecology lab at the New School, and very much the same kind of overlap of vacant land, environmental, social need, and environmental impact has been the case in each of these places. This has resulted in exhibits, installations, speculative projects, and now in New York City, we're collaborating both with an urban ecology lab at the New School led by Tim McPherson and a nonprofit engaged in job training and greening of vacant lots in at-risk neighborhoods called Green City Force. The Green City Force is the winner of awards both from the Obama White House and from the Clinton Global Initiative. It's also been very much a software product. Now, what this project actually is really a set of software tools to connect GIS. Raise your hands if you don't know what GIS is. Everyone's either knows what GIS is or is being bashful. So GIS and parametric design tools to each other. Now, we don't often think of it this way, but software, just like a building, is as much a cultural artifact as a technical solution. And software, just like buildings, contain within itself certain assumptions about how the world is. And the nature, in particular, of mapping and landscape scale software and architecturally scaled parametric software is such that until we started this work, there was actually no way to get these pieces of software to systematically talk to each other. So this is also very much an open source software project sponsored by Autodesk, by the Graham Foundation, by a range of other funders. What the software does is at least hinted at by this diagram, which is basically provides a way to, now of course we can always connect GIS to CAD by importing geometry and layers one at a time, but that's not actually what is amazing about geospatial information. What's amazing about geospatial information is all the many different kinds of things one can know about a place, not just its shape. So what the soil type is, what the building stock is made of, what all sorts of information that are now available to us as never before. And so what the software we wrote does is allow you to maintain a very extensive database of geospatial information, to query all of that from a parametric design environment and produce, in the case of these projects, thousands of individually customized design proposals that are talking to the database about all kinds of things about each individual location where a design activity is taking place, but not representing a kind of import or export of data as we're used to thinking of it, but rather representing a constantly updated kind of repository of this information that is affected by the designs, where we can simulate not just what is going on in terms of drainage and the thermodynamics of these sites before we put the designs into them, but also afterwards as well, and have that kind of iterate through a complex design process. Not necessarily big data. Big data has a very specific definition which is even larger than the data that we're talking about here, but certainly allowing our design tools to engage medium-sized data at the scale of cities and landscapes has been very much the goal of this work. I will explain what it amounts to, what ends up with in the context of what may seem like a very anachronistic thing to do with a project that is this digital, but it is in the nature of the digital to be very ephemeral, and it is the nature of an argument to want to stick around. And so to the extent that this work is an argument as well as just a piece of software, it was very important to produce a tangible artifact from it, which is this book, which I was very lucky to be able to work on the design of with a Dutch graphic design studio, Catalog Tree, one kind of leading information design practice in Europe. The collaboration was funded by the Graham Foundation, and the collaboration resulted in this book and in the exhibits that is in your school, so I thought I would talk a little bit about it. Whatever else you can say about the book, it is very, very yellow. And its yellowness, if nothing else, is symptomatic of an attempt to think through also the techniques and technologies of bookmaking, of the overlaying of multiple inks, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. We substituted a highly fluorescent yellow for the conventional yellow, which meant that we couldn't depict kind of normal looking photographs in it, but we could start to pull apart the actual production process of the book and assign to different plates and colors and layers different kinds of information. So the book takes you through the argument that I just took you through in terms of the environmental impact of looking at vacant lots here in San Francisco. And then it has many, many individual drawings for design proposals. A version of the exhibit that you have here was shown at the Lisbon Architecture Triennial this fall, and I'm using those slides since you guys were wonderful enough to finish the exhibit today, but I didn't have images of it before today. But the exhibit shows you, the book and the exhibit are arranged in the same way, again with the kind of explanation on the left, all the maps, and then each of these individual drawings has a kind of code to it, not just the local code of the software, but a kind of encoding of how environmental data shaped a specific provision of urban environmental infrastructure on each site. Its dimension, its scale, its position, that's all the code is controlling, and that's all we really designed. We didn't go ahead and design, swing sets and park benches and illumination on each of these sites. And that was also for a very specific social and political reason, which is that one couldn't actually imagine getting to that level of detail in a project like this without an engagement and collaboration with the communities actually impacted by it. So that's why the designs are somewhat encoded, is because we wanted to be very particular about what we could code for using environmental simulation and what we could not code for because it would need to be governed by a kind of social collaboration. So that results in the layout of the book and the exhibit. Moving from left to right, you go from east to west in San Francisco, and then the size of each individual drawing is controlled by the environmental impact or contribution of each individual design. Again, in the center of the exhibit are these perspectives, which are an attempt very much to show some design, but not so much as would start to be kind of getting into the architect's desire to be overly controlling. So each drawing provides a kind of code that can be decoded with a key, and here a kind of sample site also shows you how much the relationship between the individual contribution of that particular site and the actual scale of infrastructure of the city as a whole. After we did this work in San Francisco, we were approached by the Amigos de los Rios, in a nonprofit based in Pasadena, and asked by them to collaborate in a study of a particular kind of site in LA, which they had always thought would be, could and should be of particular utility in LA's ecology and environment. In particular, they were interested in sites like this one, sites underneath billboards. Billboards kind of grow like mushrooms along the highways and large avenues of Los Angeles, and these billboards have plots of land underneath them that are leased by companies like CBS Outdoor and Clear Channel, and the lots underneath the billboards are often either fenced off or just used as surface parking lots. And so in this case, a map didn't exist of these and a database didn't exist of these, so we had to create it using the Amazon Mechanical Turk and a lot of volunteer labor. We created a database of 768 sites, vacant lots along billboards, along highways and avenues in LA, and then we cross-referenced that with, we ground truth that with a database of 150 sites that this nonprofit had found just by walking around, and we thought we were pretty good, and then we made a series of proposals for a certain kind of infrastructure that could go in to allow these sites to continue to function in a way that would serve the interests of the companies, but also with a relatively minimal investment could make a big impact on the actual ecology of LA. And as in San Francisco, a lot of what we're drawing here is water. Flooding and stormwater are a huge problem in California. We tend to get cycles of drought and flood that are only accelerating in the current climate. And so the stormwater system is never really built to a capacity that can actually handle the amount of water you get at a flood, but then the soil dries out over the course of several years and things get really out of whack. And so again, this is a proposal for not to replace the sewer system, but to kind of level it out and balance it with minimal investment in these vacant sites. The next project we did was actually the result of an invitation from the curators of the 2012 U.S. Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale. The curators were the Institute of Urban Design in New York. The Biennale was curated by Kathy Lang Ho. The institute was founded by Michael Sorkin. They were interested very much in our work on vacant sites and their potential for social and ecological utility, and they invited us to myself and my collaborators to do a workshop in the American Pavilion during the Biennale all about vacant lots in American cities. And I said, that's great, but it doesn't make sense to me to fly 5,000 miles from California to Venice and get a bunch of students there to talk about sites in America that they can't visit or engage with or have no idea about. And I also had the experience of directing in 2004, 2005, University of Virginia's program in architecture and landscape architecture in Venice. So I knew something about the city and something about the place. And in particular, I knew that there was a huge problem with abandoned territory in Venice. Not in the center of the city, which is overrun with 8 million tourists occupying a city of 60,000. There's very little up for grabs in that space. But if you expand your idea of Venice even slightly, you find all of these abandoned islands in the Venetian lagoon that were a historic part of the landscape of the city, but now are completely abandoned. So we led a kind of amazing workshop with Italian and American architecture students who were able to get themselves there to Venice. The workshop was offered for free and supported by my college. And we looked in particular at 60 islands in the lagoon that had historically been part of the, this is an engraving from 1528 that shows you how the city itself conceived of itself as these parts as part of the city. And in fact, not only that, but these islands always had a kind of an amazing role in the city, which is where you put either the crazy people or the sick people or the artists, right? So they served as a kind of extended, almost a kind of extended unconscious of the city where some of the most interesting things happened that weren't quite ready to come into the center, but that were, for better or for worse, going to have an influence on it. And so the workshop actually, the Venice is has a huge issues with the ecology of its lagoon and huge issues with the economy of its lagoon. The ecology, the introduction of a big chemical port, chemical manufacturing industry into the Venetian lagoon after the Second World War contributed to a huge loss in groundwater, polluting of the lagoon, and then the dredging of deep channels for both cruise ships and freighters has meant that the Venetian lagoon has gone from a kind of spongy, complex marsh to a sort of flat-bottomed bathtub of just salt water. And the deepest, where the deepest point in the Adriatic is actually inside the Venetian lagoon. and is the result of scouring from enormous cruise ships. And so we proposed at the same time on the economic side, Venice has gone from a multivalent economy to a monoculture of tourism. As I said, 8 to 15 million visitors a year, depending on your definition, most of which these days are coming in cruise ships, so they leave no economic trace in the city. They go out with packed lunches from the cruise ship and don't even spend any money. And the city's population is declining such that at the current trends, if you extend the statistics doesn't work this way, but if you extend the line of the depopulation of locals from Venice, by 2040, Venice will have no people and only tourists. Right now it's at about 60,000. It was at 250,000 after the Second World War, and it's declining sharply. So we proposed that for these vacant islands, that a kind of combination of ecology and economy be the result of direct investment by the city in both a kind of series of constructed wetlands that would help alleviate some of the worst of the tidal scouring in the Venetian lagoon and give it back its kind of spongy, help give the lagoon back its very important role in alleviating flooding, and then also take one of the best and only creative parts of the current Venetian economy, which are these temporary exhibitions of the Biennale, but that happen episodically every other year, and and make them a 12-month series of residencies in these islands that would actually produce a more viable creative economy. Venice is also a really, really good example of how spending a lot of money on big infrastructure gets you nothing. Because in the premiership of Silvio Berlusconi, a popular businessman who rose to the Italian prime ministership, promising change, arranged an enormous investment in infrastructure in the Venetian lagoon, some almost over 200 million euros of spending on an enormous system called the Modulo Sperimentale Elettromeccanico, or MOSE, which is supposed to be these enormous floating floodgates which are on the bottom of the lagoon and are supposed to alleviate the worst of Venetian flooding, but they are already predicted to be lower than the peak flood 10 years from now. And when they go up, if they stay up, they will completely kill the actual native ecology of the lagoon, which relies on a twice daily complete tidal exchange of the water of the whole lagoon. So there's that. Okay, then in New York City, I was asked to collaborate with the Urban Ecology Lab at the New School, led by an ecologist named Timon McPherson. He and his lab have mapped over 30,000 vacant lots in New York City and have done an intensive ecological study of 1,500 of them. And so in this case, we were able to not pretend to be environmental scientists ourselves, but actually collaborate with real live environmental scientists on visualizing what these recommended ecological investments would look like on all of these, on these 1,500 closely studied sites in New York City. And again, you can see some of the uses to which we put the 4 plates of offset printing in trying to render these designs with a combination of abstraction and definition, which we thought was appropriate to the work. Okay. So there's that. So that's both a kind of proposal about practice. It's the design of some shapes, not final shapes for things, but some draft shapes for a bunch of things. And it's a kind of thought about how we can better use the power of software, not just to design the same ways we always have better, but to actually open up new ways of design and new ways of thinking about space. If the world is ever more described by information, are there better and more useful ways to mediate the relationship between information and the making of architecture and cities? So that's the kind of first part of the talk. The second part of the talk is really my attempt to undo and critique and undermine everything I've just told you. Through the lens of a certain kind of architectural history that is also very closely related, I would argue, to everything I've been talking about for the first half of the lecture. And this, the hinge here is really returning to this character, Gordon Matta-Clark, and to his history, and thinking about what it might mean in the context of this work I've just shown you. Does everyone here know who Gordon Matta-Clark is? Is he still the staple of architectural education that he has been? So raise your hand. No? No? So Gordon Matta-Clark, I will tell you who he is in the course of this lecture, but I'm just interested in knowing whether you've heard of him before. This project that Gordon Matta-Clark did, mapping 11 vacant lots in New York City, it was called Fake Estates, Reality Properties. But one of the many interesting things about it, it's been widely published and presented. The actual artifacts that he collected about these lots in New York are enormously valuable. They sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars and are represented by the David Zwirner Gallery in New York. So a very interesting sense of value of drawings. But Gordon Matta-Clark never intended this to be an exhibited artwork. It was actually only reconstructed. Gordon Matta-Clark tragically died of pancreatic cancer at the age of 37 in 1978. And the contents, what is now this very famous artwork called Fake Estates, 11 sets of photographs and titles to vacant lots in New York City, was really just the contents of a box that he kept because he didn't know what to do with them. And a curator convinced his wife his widow to put them frame them into an artwork in 1992, already 10 or 15 years after he had died. So already it's a kind of strange thing because it wasn't a thing that was meant by its author to be a thing. It's not even a thing, it's just a collection of information about 11 vacant lots in New York that Gordon Matta-Clark bought but then went back to the city after his death. And, what was, pieces of paper like this one, a tax receipt and all the rest. And yet it has, in the life of curatorship, in the life of, if you Google Fake Estates, a million things will come up. There's whole books about the work, elaborate critical and theoretical discourses. So it might behoove us to spend a little bit of time saying, well, let's not judge by scale, but if, these 11 sites have had just an enormous, 11 vacant lots have had an enormous cultural and architectural history in terms of their influence on the profession and on the way people have thought about territory. And so in my lecture about 3,659 vacant lots, these are way more important, these 11, than my 3,659, but it might be interesting to dig into what they were and what a project like mine might mean in terms of a project like this. It's also very important, so raise your hand if you have heard of Gordon Matta-Clark, and raise your hand if you haven't. It's totally okay. Okay. So Gordon Matta-Clark, when I was in architecture school, 15 years ago, Gordon Matta-Clark was still very much someone on the lips of architecture students. And you'll see why when I show you a little bit of his history and what he did. He cast himself very much as an anti-architect. He literally called himself at that. I will, later on in a few minutes, I'll talk about a specific episode when he shot out all the windows to Peter Eisenman's Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies with a rifle. This was I'm not making it up. This totally happened. And there was a really deep conflict at the time between what he thought of himself as standing for and what the architectural establishment thought himself as standing for, which is part of why he's always been such an attractive figure to architectural students, because no one is more victimized by the architectural establishment than the architecture student. And so the notion of someone, literally taking up arms in that situation is really interesting. Okay. But one of the things just with that kind of little vision of what Gordon Matta-Clark might represent as a figure in architectural history, it's also very important to understand that, again, a bit like the Fake Estates itself, the history is sort of way more interesting if you look at it, because just like these 11, maps of vacant lots weren't actually ever designed by Matta-Clark to be looked at on their own neither was Gordon Matta-Clark, who is always cast as a kind of anti-figure to the architectural establishment. He wasn't entirely separate from the architectural establishment either. And in fact, he was pretty close in his own history to the center of what we might regard as architectural history. For one thing, his father, Roberto Matta, was a Chilean immigrant from Chile to Paris, where he was an intern and then employee in the studio of Le Corbusier, and he drafted all of these drawings for the Ville Radieux, Gordon Matta-Clark's father. And Gordon Matta-Clark was Roberto Matta-Clark's father then ended up leaving Corbusier's studio in a kind of bit of a controversial way, because he suddenly decided that Corbusier's work was only useful to a non-existent person who lived in perfect harmony with society in his work. And he couldn't stand that, and so he went and fell in with the Surrealists instead, designed crazy structures like a house whose walls consisted entirely of moistened sheets, and then went to become a painter. And a sculptor, and was very, and here is young Gordon Matta-Clark photographed with a sculpture from Giacometti's Surrealist stage, and Giacometti and Matta and Duchamp were all part of the same circle, and Duchamp was in fact Matta-Clark's, the godfather of both Gordon Matta-Clark and his twin brother Sebastian Matta. Here's a photo of Roberto Matta and the young Gordon Matta-Clark on Long Island Sound. Matta-Clark's father was also, is this lecture being recorded? It is? Oh, I'll say it anyway. He was a bit of an asshole. He left, he was a philanderer, and he left Gordon Matta-Clark and his twin brother with their American mother in New York, went back to Paris, and Gordon Matta-Clark's relationship with him had all the kind of complexities that result from a father abandoning a young family and his children. And so he would get together during the summers, etc. But like a lot of children with an absent father, he always looked up to his father as well as despising him. And so when Matta-Clark decided he wanted to be an artist, his father told him that the only training, all advice is autobiographical, and Matta-Clark's father said, well, the only training to really become an artist is architecture. And so Gordon Matta-Clark, knowing he wanted to be an artist, went and enrolled in the undergraduate architecture program at Cornell in 1962. His first year grades were pretty unremarkable. His grades were incredibly spotty after that. They go from a D+ in structures, so you'll be okay. A B- in studio. There's a specific course, let's see, where's the course? History of Architecture 401 here. That's an interesting class. He got a B- there. They were on numbered grades. But that class was taught by a very specific person and represented a very specific landmark in the history of Cornell. It represented the moment when an architectural historian named Colin Rowe went along with a bunch of his former colleagues from the University of Texas at Austin to Cornell and a couple of other schools on the East Coast. And these were the so-called Texas Rangers. And they were called the Texas Rangers. I will not actually sing this, but they were called the Texas Rangers. They didn't call themselves that. That was a nickname given to them by the students, which, like a lot of things that students say about teachers, was fundamentally true, even if not always flattering. And the nickname came from this adapted song set to the tune of a Western song named Streets of Laredo, and it goes like this. Oh, I am a ranger, and I come from Texas. Oh, I am a ranger, and I am teaching you. We are Lee, John, and Werner, and we are all rangers. Just get you the good book, and you'll be one too. And the good book was this book, the Oeuvre Complete, which was the kind of Bible of a certain kind of this new formalist approach to architectural education, which, believe me, you are still experiencing and being taught today. This is the kind of lingua franca of modern American architectural education, and it was based in large part on the work of these figures, people like John Haydock, Colin Rowe, Slutsky, Lee, John was Haydock, Lee, which was Lee? I'm forgetting all the names now. Anyway, people who went on to become the prominent deans, etc., of American architectural education. Werner Seligman, and I'm forgetting Lee's last name. Anyway, the basis of this approach to architectural education was in large part a single essay published by Colin Rowe in the Architectural Review, in which he focused on a kind of formal comparison. The essay was called The Mathematics of the Ideal Villa, and it equated and flattened together the Villa Malcontenta by Palladio and the Villa Stein de Monzi by Corbusier, and talked about their kind of shared properties, shared formal properties, and then made out of this a proposal for architectural education, which was both deeply historical and trans-historical or ahistorical, and mostly focused on form and formal exercises and their provision in response to, if you're lucky, site conditions, but if not, just their architecture's response to itself, to each other. This was an attempt to craft what was called, and is still called by people like Pier Vittorio Arelli, an autonomous mode of architectural creation. And it was also an attempt to provide for architecture what, say, painting had in something like abstract expressionism, which is a mode of making that referred not to the outside world, but just to the history and mode within that creative discipline itself. The sine qua non of all of this was, of course, the 9-square grid problem, which is still being taught in many schools to this day. That class, which Matta-Clark got a B- in, was a class by Colin Rowe purely on Baroque facades. One slide of Baroque facades after another for the entire semester. We can easily imagine that it was precisely such an overlay of facade studies that produced the following exchange in a 1974 interview with Gordon Matta-Clark in Avalanche magazine, which was a downtown art scene magazine. And the interviewer asks, "You studied architecture at Cornell, didn't you?" And Matta-Clark responds, "Yeah, that was my first trap. But the things we studied always involved such surface formalism that I never had a sense of the ambiguity of a structure, the ambiguity of a place, and that's the quality I'm interested in generating in everything I do." Rowe's formally precise response to time, mass, and surface was fundamental to the Texas curriculum. It also was fundamental to the later group of which he became an honorary member and critical figurehead, which was the group of Peter Eisenman, Michael Graves, Charles Gwathmey, John Haydock, and Richard Meyer, the New York Five, or as they came to be known, the Whites, which was not a description of race, although it might have well have been, but rather the complexion of both their sort of Corb-inflected buildings and of the cover of the 1972 catalog, Five Architects, which brought them to prominence. In the catalog's introduction, the curator, Arthur Drexler, of the MoMA show, of which it was a record, renders explicit the retreat from politics that accompanied the group's formal concerns, even as distinct from the original funding for the Peter Eisenman's Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, which had actually been largely social in nature and focused on housing. Architecture, Drexler declared, is the least likely instrument with which to accomplish the revolution. And then Colin Rowe begins his second longer introduction by excusing the apolitical nature of the work through an optimistic but somewhat elliptical argument that in America the revolution had already occurred in 1776. Okay. And then, Rowe also says, establishes another essential contrast in the same introduction between this work and not an architectural style per se, but rather to the collision of what Rowe himself, in quotes, the computer and the people. And this was a whole other thing that was happening in the 1960s, which we also see traces very much of today, which is the collision between the aerospace industry, the Apollo-era aerospace industry, and the huge problems of, or what were perceived especially to be the huge problems of mid-century American cities. They resulted in the development of some of the first mapping and CAD programs to map and chart urban renewal in illustrations like this one, a kind of completely reductive model of all of the problems of modern Pittsburgh by the Air Force's RAND consultancy. They resulted in the assertion by Hubert Humphrey in 1968 that the same techniques that are going to put a man on the moon are going to be the techniques that we're going to clean up our cities. This is the DNA of a lot of the use of computing in architecture. And in fact, Matta-Clark had a semester in New York City studying urban policy with the Lindsay administration for which these RAND consultants were later on working. So as a result, Matta-Clark was flanked by two very distinct abstract frameworks claiming ownership over architecture in the city. On the one hand, the kind of formal machinations of the Texas curriculum, and on the other hand, these highly technocratic, kind of numerically based responses to how the city could be enumerated and solved with computing. He wasn't really comfortable with either one, although he did work for a year after graduation for the Binghamton Redevelopment Authority doing mapping and computing work, and that was the only job he actually held in his life. But staying for that extra year working for the Binghamton Redevelopment Authority provided this super extra bonus, which was his role as an assistant and hanger-on to a groundbreaking exhibit called Earth Art, mounted in 1968 at Cornell, which was the kind of originating story of much of what we later know as the land art movement. Matta-Clark served as an assistant to the artist Dennis Oppenheim, cutting a long dogleg trench into Lake Cayuga with a chainsaw, and perhaps even more influentially, loaned Robert Smithson his truck. Robert Smithson was the kind of central figure of much of the land art movement and became a kind of mentor along with Oppenheim to Matta-Clark as he moved down to New York City and started his own art career. Matta-Clark's final, as I've foreshadowed, Matta-Clark's final attitude towards his architectural education, not to mention the Cornell crowd's movement parallel and alongside his own downstate trajectory into New York City's avant-garde, was never so violently and publicly illustrated as when he shot out the windows of the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies with an air rifle. He once borrowed my gun to do a piece at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, remembers Oppenheim. I was extremely excited about that. I'm going to read for a second because I want to get the facts straight, because this is an event which you can imagine of which endless anecdotes are told, and almost all of them are actually somehow inaccurate. But best as I've been able to figure out, this is what actually happened. According to Andrew McNair, who was the curator of the exhibit in question, which was called Idea as Model, Matta-Clark's contribution was supposed to be something quite different. The partial cutting and demolition of the windowless sheetrock cube of a conference room that was in the center of the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies space. Also included in the exhibition were Graves, Gwathmey, Haydock, and Meyer, as well as more up-and-coming designers like Todd Williams, Rodolfo Machado, and Jorge Silvetti. But in the pre-dawn hours of the long night of the gallery installation, Matta-Clark arrived with a very different contribution from the imagined cutting. He entered the gallery bearing sheaves of photographs of shard-shrouded, defenestrated housing projects mounted on mapboard and the aforementioned gun. After asking permission to break a few already cracked planes in the loft studio, Matta-Clark shattered every one. And if the critical and historical position was implied, the emotion was not. These were the guys I studied with at Cornell, he reportedly explained. These were my teachers. I hate what they stand for. The windows were just as quickly replaced by an appalled Eisenman, though the catalog to the exhibit, emerging only 4 years later, allowed only that the installation made the gallery too chilly. Okay. Keep writing me. I'm very interested in your anti-architect architecture. Matta the father wrote to Matta-Clark the son in an archived and undated letter. The cross-language pun meaning how to be an architect and against architects at once. Work with abandoned spaces, Matta-Clark was to write in 1974, began with my concern for the life of a city of which a major side effect is the metabolization of old buildings. In New York, as in many urban centers, the availability of empty and neglected structures is a prime textual reminder of the ongoing fallacy of renewal through modernization. Interestingly enough, what we now think of, what Matta-Clark was referring to as metabolization of buildings, we would now call by another name, which is gentrification. Because in fact, Matta-Clark's employment in downtown, Matta-Clark supported himself when he arrived in New York City. He was the only person, he was a very bad architecture student, but he still knew a hell of a lot more about plumbing and construction than any of his colleagues in the downtown art scene. So he was one of the major kind of contractors for hire in constructing the kind of archetypical space of gentrification, which is the Soho loft. And he opened with a couple of his artist friends what was described at the time as the first restaurant in Soho. It was actually the first restaurant for white people in Soho because the restaurant it took over and replaced was as you can see from the sign, a Hispanic restaurant for the laid-off workers in the former industrial site, light lofts in the city. In Soho, rather. So Matta-Clark, at the same time, developed in a very important way around literally drawing from his experience of renovating these lofts, the artistic and architectural practice he was most known for, which is a series of cuts and modifications to buildings as an artwork. And these are, in a way that I would say isn't usually acknowledged, really coming directly out of his experience of renovation. They're a kind of hardening of the edge of renovation to do something else. The first one of his sort of architectural installations was the rerouting of a small piece of section of drywall in the Green Street Gallery to expose one of the sewer pipes that was inside the wall. Just this short 1-foot span of sewer pipe, and then a series of photographs of where that sewer pipe went, above that cut and where it went below the cut. So literally, if you'll excuse my language again, taking the shit out of the walls and revealing it and then understanding where it goes. So really understanding the building itself as a kind of metabolic object. This led to a series of larger and larger activities on the bodies of buildings, which were epitomized by his cutting of an entire house in Englewood, New Jersey, right outside of New York City, in half, from top to bottom, excising of an inch of material from the center of this building, with the same materials he'd been working on with the lofts, with sawzalls, with chisels, all the rest. And then a kind of slow, and then a cutting of the foundation to allow one half of the house to be slowly tipped back from that inch-long cut and create this a kind of elongated slice. Crucially, this was also a project that was all about urban redevelopment, even though, again, it's not often reported as such. This house was only available because it had been slated for urban renewal by the government of Newark and had been speculatively purchased by Horace Solomon, an art dealer, in the knowledge that it was likely to be bought at a higher price by the government for urban renewal. So this is the final house. This kind of cemented Matta-Clark's reputation, and also is a weird kind of speculation on value as well. These corners, which he removed, are now in the collection of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and they're insured for about $3 million. So this was the group of people around these kinds of actions called themselves the An-Architecture Group. Gordon Matta-Clark was one of the only kind of architecturally trained people in the group. It also included people like Laurie Anderson, dancers, painters, etc. Our thinking about An-Architecture Matta-Clark explained in 1974, was more elusive than doing pieces that would demonstrate an alternate attitude to buildings, or rather the attitudes that determine usable space. We were thinking more about metaphoric voids, gaps, leftover spaces, places that were not developed. Even the name of the group, the Anarchitecture Group, was not to be fixed. It changed with every mention, from anarchy torture to an Arctic lecture to an art collector. And in this, in 1973, we see the first mention in this aerogram, which is something that used to exist to mail things cheaply from abroad. It's sort of folded up into its own envelope. We see the first mention of fake estates, property slivers with some projected ideas for them. Death, unfortunately, brings a kind of unasked for certainty. And the current view of fake estates, more often than not, declares them finished, much like the buildings that vexed and transfixed the artist. But the actual life of what they were in his practice at the time is much more interesting. One thing that's clear is by 1977, Matta-Clark had done 5 or 6 enormous cuttings, spheres, circles, slivers out of buildings paid for by museums like the MCA in Chicago. He was really, by the period just before his death, thoroughly sick of cutting into buildings and exhausted by it. He was interested in networks, literally and figuratively, and he was sketching drawings like this one that are kind of networks and fragments of pieces connected to each other. Another thread emerges as well, which is of Matta-Clark's never consummated re-entry into the landscape of the digital. He had worked in this kind of urban computing center in Binghamton, but he had never been able to use computing in his own work. When Matta-Clark spent 2 weeks in September of 1975 cutting a work called Conical Intersect into 2 masonry townhouses set for demolition alongside the rising Pompidou Museum in Paris, he asked his friend Gerald Hovegman to join him from New York and share the labor. Recalling their plaster-shrouded discussions on the site, Hovegman credits Conical Intersect's inspiration to an influential media piece by the artist Anthony Monchaux, first shown 2 years prior. Line describing a cone, shown here in the Tate's collection, which consisted of a dark room where a white circle slowly appears on a black background, projected on film. Now, when this was originally shown in galleries, today if you go to the Tate and they have this up, they'll have a smoke machine in the gallery. And what the smoke machine does is it transforms the illuminated line into a cone when it goes through the gallery. But it's actually important to understand historically that the smoke machine wasn't included in the original installation because any gallery would naturally be full of smoke from people smoking. Matta-Clark became really interested in a word that we actually hear used a lot today in the context of new technology, which is virtual. The word virtual means literally something that exists only in its power to affect you. And he was interested in very precisely moving beyond this heavy, laborious cutting of geometric shapes into the making of virtual shapes with computing, as he explained, for example, to Bill Mitchell, who was later dean at MIT and director of its Media Lab. He writes, as I explained over the phone, I'm an artist who has been working sculpturally with buildings slated for demolition by cutting them to alter their internal space. Since there are immense economical and physical barriers to overcome in producing a full-scale work, I've wanted to catalog a set of more idealized spatial variations by using computer graphic techniques. Computer graphic techniques had, of course, been one of the major products of 1960s aerospace culture, more often than not used in the context of a very particular kind of proposal. This is a reworking of the Apollo lunar landing simulator by UCLA architecture faculty member Peter Kamnitzer to instead of cruising around the lunar surface, to cruise around a kind of modernist proposal for downtown LA in 1966. In the same interview in which, in 1986 interview, in which he identifies Matta-Clark's exhaustion with the physical labor of building cuts, his friend Les Levine also reflects on Matta-Clark's, quote, desire to help people, for example, on the Lower East Side, to work with them. Levine concludes pessimistically that he was never able to surrender to that space or idea. Yet history actually argues otherwise. Right before his death, Matta-Clark got an enormous grant from the Guggenheim Foundation to very precisely found a resource center, an environmental youth program for vacant lots in the Lower East Side. And he uses to describe this the word network. It was, at the time, part of the vernacular of city planning, as well, of course, as Matta-Clark's own sculptural interests. But the term also formed an essential part of a thread of urban history and urbanism to which Matta-Clark cannot but have been exposed, which is the work of Jane Jacobs, whose book, Death and Life of Great American Cities, came out in Matta-Clark's first year at Cornell. He and Jane Jacobs actually lived 2 blocks from each other throughout Jane Jacobs' childhood, and her successful leadership of the end of the Lower Manhattan Expressway resulted in an enormous parade through Matta-Clark's neighborhood and the burning of cars in Washington Square Park, which couldn't have possibly escaped a young child with anarchic tendencies. So, this, whatever its origin though, Matta-Clark's vision, like Jacobs, was of the city as a living body. For example, in his use of the words like metabolization, but also in the present in this proposal, in which he talks about, quote, an emphasis on environmental awareness. That is, attention not only to the internal needs of a building, but also its inherent connections to surrounding areas. The educational project proposed, the quote unquote environmental structural design program, is further explained as follows. In order to demonstrate new approaches to solving the housing crisis, substantially deteriorated structures weakened by either fire or age would be used, with attention paid to providing a more flexible floor space. The proposed alternative is to introduce concrete construction. The proposed introduction of concrete frame structures into the fabric of abandoned buildings is then recorded at length and justified this is a very unusual thing to propose doing to wooden buildings, but Matta-Clark justifies it initially due to cost concerns and fireproofing, but also fundamentally, he says, quote, finally, from the design aspect, it would allow cadets in the program to experiment with more advanced structural problems yielding greater spatial freedom, which is basically one of the last points of Matta-Clark's 5 points of architecture, the ability of concrete structures and the free plan to give maximum expressions to architecture. And they were very much part of the manifesto of projects like the Villa Stein de Monzi, the Villa Savoie, and the rest, the concrete texts that were in their own way the Bible of the Texas-born Cornell-bred formalism that Matta-Clark so violently professed to despise, which is a bit of a surprise. Of course, this project never found its way to realization. Several months after his last cutting was complete, with explorations in computer graphics and urban education just begun, Matta-Clark wrote to the curator, Florent Becks, quote, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but since I last wrote, the doctors opened me up and looked inside with horror at advanced cancer of the pancreas and liver. He eschewed chemotherapy in favor of natural medicine. The summer brought his marriage, and the death came on August 26th in a Nyack hospital surrounded by friends. I'm almost done. There was much in Matta-Clark's life that both appropriated and destabilized the very ideas of inheritance, legacy, and the rituals of documentation surrounding those events. The geographical terrain in fake estates still exists, returned to the city for non-payment of taxes after Matta-Clark's death, where they remain even in this survey of New York City vacant land. Matta-Clark's own interest in data and documentation means that his work really thrives in the archive. It's endlessly fussed over by historians because so much of it was endlessly documented by him in the course of making its work. The steady, constant citation, however, has not even escaped appropriation by the very architects of whose work it was substantially a critique. In 1996, the noted theorists and historians Yves Allenbois and Rosalind Krauss published this essay, A User's Guide to Entropy, in the noted art historical magazine October, which had begun itself as a publication of the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. But if October had started as part of Eisenman's intellectual stable, this work was very much, this particular essay was very much written in opposition to it. The essay chiefly concerned the work, in its central section, chiefly concerned the work of Matta-Clark and talked about its work, this work from several scales, from the experiments in molding and layering and burning physical objects to the building cuts, and concluding with an extended consideration of fake estates. Yves Allenbois, who wrote this section of the essay, emphasizes throughout what he called the sovereign contempt in Matta-Clark's attitude towards architects. At the same time as this essay was written, this question was especially unacademic, because in the 1980s, the personal computer, combined with new kinds of computer modeling software, of the sort of which Matta-Clark was no doubt dreaming, allowed a sudden and unexpectedly facile modeling of objects through deletion and staged subtraction, what are known mathematically as Boolean operations. And the tendency of this software towards an appearance of the partial and the subtractive and the deleted led to its quick adoption by formalist architects, which all explains, at least partially, why as early as 5 years after his death, Matta-Clark's career had become a kind of a method, a so-called method for the very formalist architects of which he set himself against. So Peter Eisenman made some of the first use of this software. FormZ was developed. Nobody uses FormZ anymore, but at the time it was completely new and completely revolutionary, and it was developed at Ohio State, where in its early stages Eisenman had access to it during the design of this building, the Wexner Center. And then this whole project was kind of codified through another exhibit at MoMA, Deconstructivist Architecture, for which Mark Wigley was the young research assistant, and in his and curator, handpicked by Eisenman. And Matta-Clark's Englewood House is one of only 6 illustrations in the catalog essay. So there's this immediate kind of appropriation of Matta-Clark, and Eisenman himself, soon enough, was to explicitly write about Matta-Clark and give as a precedent for his own work Matta-Clark's cutting of a building in half and so denying its function. And Eisenman, of course, emphasized the mathematical notion of the half versus the actual dismemberment of the structure. And so in this essay is literally an attempt to take this on and to take these guys to task for a kind of at the most generously we could say a kind of sloppy usage of someone's work who would not have agreed with its usage, with such usage, if he were alive. Bois adopts Matta-Clark's own voice for this purpose and writes, quote, "What I do, you could never achieve, since that presupposes accepting ephemerality. Architecture has only one destiny, and that is, sooner or later, to go down the chute." Okay. But if the adoption of Matta-Clark's formal aesthetics of transformation into the heart of 1980s formalist culture, into this aesthetic, there's a particular kind of crazy aesthetic of the deconstructionist moment, which is very precisely buildings that are self-consciously permanent, but built to look as if they're in the middle of something, right? So a kind of aestheticization of the notion of process, partially built, partially deconstructed, coming apart at the seams, but at the same time finished. They don't go on changing or moving, whereas this changing or moving was very much what Matta-Clark was interested in. But then we also have this crazy example in the course of his this program he wanted on the Lower East Side of making a project with young, disadvantaged youth in New York City, in which they do all these crazy metabolic moves on buildings, but all using the Corbusian free plan and concrete, domino frame construction, which is also kind of crazy. But in trying to sort this out, and this is the last example of the lecture, it might be useful to look at another example. In 1974, following the Englewood House, Matta-Clark undertook another house transformation. Bingo, he explains in an artist statement, is the finalized title for a work that in progress was called Being Gone by Ninths. The piece involved the use of a typical American small-town home, in fact one slated for urban renewal in upstate New York. He writes, that was to be demolished for urban renewal. During the project, a major part of the exterior was to be sectioned into 9 equal parts. Each of these facade segments was cut free, lowered intact, and created for transport, leaving the center part of the 9-part grid undisturbed. Which is, of course, the 9-square grid, the fundamental unit of Matta-Clark's own first undergraduate studio, but here kind of switched round and thoroughly changed. Instead of an enduring utopian Cartesian plane, it is the adaptive and opportunistic edges of the house's unmaking and remaking as well. The grid remains as an instrument, but its purpose is fundamentally reversed. Colin Rowe's later years involved both a softening of dogma and an opening to the particular possibilities of form in the urban context. In the late 60s and 70s, Rowe would turn to a renewed interest in the less dogmatic approach to the city as a figure ground that was the subject of, as early as 1966, this kind of work was the subject of thesis students of his, and ultimately it resulted in 1979's book, Collage City. In this book, Rowe and his co-author, Fred Coder, lament in this context, architecture's failure in the 1920s to embrace the conceptual and formal properties of collage, illustrating the point with several works of Picasso. But a more apt counterexample might be not the polite Picasso in this context, but the more violent and radical roots of Dada collage. This, one of the very first collages of newsprint ever made by the artist Hannah Hock, was called Cut with the Kitchen Knife Dada Through the Last Weimar Beer Belly Cultural Epoch in Germany. This would maybe figure importantly in such a story, not only for its political content, but for how its action, the cut with the kitchen knife, is set against the alcoholic, rotund, and masculine power structure of the day. The kitchen knife, of course, is a tool ready to hand, first as the instrument of an oppressive hierarchy, in this case the 19th century German woman relegated to service, but then precisely the instrument also of rebellion and remaking and creation at the same time. It's what you have in the drawer, and it's what you use, and it's how you make your way out of the situation. It is in the light maybe of this story that we might regard Matta-Clark's proposal's uncanny introduction of Corbusier's 5 points into the interior fabric of Lower East Side buildings. Here, with the same logic as the demolition chisel became a creative implement in Matta-Clark's building cuts, the very same instrument of the mid-century city's unmaking, the Tower in the Park visions that were of a piece with Le Corbusier's 5 points, are unmoored from their origins and rearranged into the reverse. Like an oyster's irritation, they are metabolized, coated, and incorporated into the urban fabric, the resulting pearl providing structure and value. From today's distance, we cannot really imagine the shapes that would have emerged from Matta-Clark's Lower East Side studio exercises, the excisions, the remakings, the repurposings and reinventions, whether they would have been real or virtual, concrete or conceptual, or all of these at once. But we can imagine their precision and precise framing of something distinctly and quintessentially urbane, representing not the inevitable failure of architecture to cheat death, but the city's enduring ability to frame and reframe life. For it is truly the destiny of all of us and of all of our architecture to go down the chute. But it is in the nature of the city, in its shifting networks and network metabolisms, to enduringly survive. Thank you very much. So I've already overstayed my welcome, so I really don't mind if you don't have any questions or want to skedaddle, but if there's anyone with questions, I would also be happy to. I know that really probably didn't make an enormous amount of sense, even to me, but no question is too dumb. I want nothing more than to talk about this stuff, so yeah.
First of all, thank you. And I was just curious, you presented one piece of work first and then the second piece of work second.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how they actually came about, and was that the order in which you thought about them, or did
Yeah,
investigate?
absolutely. Yeah. So,
And sort of how did the
Yeah.
Matta-Clark come out of what you were doing?
You know, it's funny because so an architecture lecture when I was a graduate student in the late 1990s and early 2000s, it was the moment of a certain kind of, digital formalism and blobotecture, but it was still a moment where you would have someone like Greg Lynn would come to Princeton to lecture, but he would still be using slides photographed from a computer screen, right? So it was a really strange moment of mediation, and there would still be a notion that came very much out of the Eisenman school that one justified one's actions fundamentally with theory, or when constructed a theoretical framework in which one's architecture could not be critiqued without like an advanced knowledge of that theoretical framework. That's the classic like Eisenmanian move. And so all that stuff appeared. So in Greg's lectures, which were typical at the time, you got like 10 minutes on Deleuze and the fold, and then you got a whole bunch of buildings, but you couldn't really critique them as buildings without referring to the specific pieces of Deleuze in the fold, and as architecture, it was like, I don't know that. So like it sort of, kind of cauterized any potential criticism, which is whereas the, nowadays, of course, we have, with the profusion of PowerPoint slides, we don't actually get a lot of theory in lectures anymore. We just get like, oftentimes there's this performance that the lecturer, I don't know if you've seen this, but there's this performance that the lecturer does like right before the lecture, where there's this window with like 5,000 PowerPoint slides, and they're all just being shuffled around live in front of you, and then you just get like a bunch of stuff. And you're not given any tools it's not, maybe not as bad as like giving a kind of hermetic theoretical language which you don't understand as a way to critique the work, but neither is it giving you any way to think about it. It's just showing you a bunch of stuff. And so very much what I tried to do here, like, when you get the chance to do something that you saw as a student, you always want to do it like the way you wish it had been done. This is one of the great, one of the great joys of getting older, right? And so to me, it's like, well, I've had a lot of experience showing this work. The work predates a lot of the theoretical and critical components of it, but I think it's really important to critique your own work and to understand all the ways in which your own work is terrible, right? Because which is not the same thing as thinking it's terrible, right? Because that's the creative voice that you need to silence, but the critical voice you need to listen to, and needs to be a caution. And so when I started to do this work and presented it, and it's interesting and exciting and digital and all the things we're interested in these days, but I also was really interested in this history and said, well, would it be possible to investigate this history a little bit and use it as a way to both frame and critique the work? And then in the order is very important, because to me at least, it's very important for me to present the work to you and then give you as many tools as you can to critique it and talk about it with me and understand why it might not, and this kind of spooky overlap between Matta-Clark's own history, his interest in computers, in mapping, his interest in vacant space, was all completely unknown to me when I did the original work. I just liked Fake Estates, which I thought had been an artwork that he did. And so the kind of excavation of all this history was both a little spooky, it was a little weird to sit there in the CCA archives and be like, oh wait, he was really interested in actually doing stuff in vacant spaces, and he was really interested in computing, but they were too expensive and he couldn't actually get access to them. And so that was a really interesting history to uncover. But then I think it also begs the question, it's like, well, by talking about this history, I say, well, this is something maybe along the lines of what Matta-Clark might have done, but I'm sure he would have done it much better, right? So, or in other ways, in more complex ways. And it's very much a piece of work that it's in its infancy. And so I'm most interested in a conversation about it and in giving the people I talk to the tools, the best conversation possible, which was, in my mind, the point of or at least my goal in the lecture. Whether I achieved it or not is up to you. Yeah. Yeah. You can remember back that far? Yeah.
You talked a lot about the second, and
Yeah.
so maybe they were like the first kind of trying to be a citizen, and then
Yeah.
kind of trying to be an architect, and you also talked about the trillions of dollars that are about to be invested in big infrastructure, which is maybe defined by you as completely useless and sad.
Yeah.
And then you described all these really fascinating ways to do micro infrastructure. So I'm just wondering, is it the architect's job to become the citizen and cite all of those different things, and how do you do that?
Gosh, I mean, that's the question that I ask with the lecture. I'm not sure that I have, certainly I don't have the answer, maybe an answer. I think that one of the things, if you study the 1960s and what happened with architects, for a large period of the middle of the last century, even if they didn't exactly know how cities worked or what made them tick, they certainly pretended like they did. And they were very happy to, design the biggest things possible. What architect wouldn't, like to design, the biggest thing possible and the most kind of top-down, large-scale work, and that, in the context of urban renewal, that was a cataclysmic failure. That's what Jane Jacobs, people don't understand that Jane Jacobs was an architecture critic for like 15 years before she wrote Death and Life of Great American Cities. That Lewis Mumford was successful in casting her as like an activistic housewife, but she was actually like an editor at Architectural Record, and she was assigned the project of critiquing housing projects as architecture and urban renewal projects as architecture, but she was like, oh, there's something that these things aren't getting. What is it? And then she expanded out and developed this whole thesis about the metabolic nature of the city and the way in which these large projects cut off all the dense networks that actually made the city resilient and work. And so I think we are, my biggest fear is that, we are a nation that needs to invest in infrastructure. Our infrastructure is aging, all our old infrastructure needs reinvestment, but my fear is that even if we're capable of mustering what is actually in the Trump plan probably mostly going to be private money that somehow, I'm not sure how quite it's going to work, but even the most optimistic scenario, if we spend a lot of money, we will spend it not on the right kind of infrastructure. We won't spend it renewing existing infrastructure, which is what we really need, but we'll spend it on the things which politicians like, which are big new things that they can stand in front of for a photo opportunity and say, I built this, I made this. The relationship between power and building big things is, as old as the pyramids, right? So that's what tends to happen, whereas we are going into a moment caused by the incontrovertible scientific fact of anthropogenic climate change, where the real challenges to our cities and landscapes will be highly unpredictable. Climate change is the pouring of more energy into the global weather system, which makes it slightly warmer, but that's not really the point. It makes it also suddenly colder because there's, and suddenly hotter and much more dynamic and unexpected. And what helps, so that's going to be a challenge. We saw already in New Orleans what a challenge these catastrophic weather events are to the resiliencies of cities and communities. And so I think that when we really think the real challenge of our own age is how to sustain and bolster all of those invisible networks that make the city happen. And so this is a small way of thinking about one particular opportunity, which is vacant lots, and the kind of what they represent in the city urban landscape, what they represent in terms of the neglect of certain communities, what they represent in terms of certain communities having within them the territory that is most useful for the resilience of the city as a whole, which is, if you get nothing else from this lecture, that's the important thing. And so, but there are many, many other ways to think through those challenges and opportunities too. But as architects, we owe it to the cities and landscapes that we seek to engage and sustain to really understand what makes them tick, which is not like a big, thing that, a big box like sitting on a cafeteria of architecture, sitting on a cafeteria tray of landscape, but it's the extent to which everything's connected. And when you pull one little thing in the city, you end up pulling the whole city with it. And so we can't design this, for that. We can't even predict it. It's a complex dynamic system. We would never be able to really predict what's going on in the city. You would need to do more computations than there are atoms in the universe. But you can work with what is there and the way in which those landscapes work and seek to augment resilience where it already exists and not just declare it there, by a big thing.
Okay, so I'm trying to stitch together a lot of things in the lecture, so in a good way though,
Yeah.
and so this might be jumbled up.
Yeah.
And I'm really fascinated by the way that you kind of set up your project and then undermine it, which is why I'm so curious about it. So one thing that I'm really interested in is the tension that seems to exist both between your approach and then the approach you bring through with Gordon Matta-Clark, and then even within your own project on the local life code, between the kind of politicization of these spaces through, say, making them visible, which is grounded in fake estates, but then also the coding, which seems, well, on the one hand, the kind of making visible, like Matta-Clark, seems to be about the kind of individual agent and the ability for that individual subjectivity to make that visible and to operate in that space. And then the coding, which seems to collectivize that issue, but also equalize the variables through the kind
Right.
of algorithmic
Yeah.
aspects of it. So my question is sort of wondering about that tension and how you see that, maybe how you see architecture or design thinking or the discipline as operating within that kind of moment of tension.
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. You know, the relationship between, I mean, if I can try and summarize my understanding of your question, it's to juxtapose our individual agency as people who are able to envisage the city as a whole and understand and tease out questions of form and meaning in the larger landscape of the city, and then the kind of the tyranny of form, you know, of imposing form on the city, and the flattening of all, you know, of everything into a kind of sameness, which is not how that landscape actually is. And that, I agree that it's a tension in the work. I think that you know, one of my enduring efforts in all of this is, and maybe Abigail can knows whether this quote is really true or not, but it was once described to me that and I haven't been able to actually find the reference, that Christopher Alexander reportedly said in the last SIAM conference that computers will never be useful in architecture because they can only replace the work of 1,000 clerks, and there are no problems in architecture susceptible to the work of 1,000 clerks. Which, again, I don't know if the quote's true, but if it is true, it's one of the smartest things he ever said, because, you know, fundamentally, we as a discipline, you know, my own experience of architectural school, I was literally the very last dog end of architecture students at my school to be taught with like a Mayline in year 1. And by year 3, Brian can, you know, attest to this, by my final year, we were all in like Dilbert cubicles, white painted Dilbert cubicles with like computers on every desk, and that moment was gone. So we are still in the midst of an enormous cultural, social, economic, political shift in how we make things in the world, how the world makes things, and thus how we as architects have to operate. And the major shift is the advent of computerization of everything we do. And this leads to a kind of, you know, in the guise of something like, you know, Patrick Schumacher's parametric urbanism, this can lead to a highly positivistic, you know, insane notion that somehow we can compute and predict, and form will solve everything in the city by its kind of optimization. Computers seek to optimize. This is what all this like aerospace software does. And so, but optimizing in the city just doesn't work. You can't optimize a city to be itself. A city is like inherently suboptimal at many, you know, any individual things, but really robust at doing a whole bunch of different things because of its complexity and interconnectivity. Trying to figure out this project was I wanted to move beyond just mapping into design, because I'm a designer. It's what I do. It's what, and yet the project was an attempt to think through, maybe not entirely successfully, well, what can the computer do here? The computer, you know, maybe in some socially mediated future could help us do community engagement, but we're not there yet. It maybe could help us do collaborative design, but we're not quite there yet. What it can do is help us visualize the thermodynamics of all these spaces and show cities and mayors and other people precisely, not just in the abstract, how all these sites could do this expensive and valuable infrastructural work, but rather show with a series of very definite proposals, this is exactly how you could spend the minimum of resources spread out on these 1,500 sites or 3,000 sites to accomplish these goals. And we can, you know, we can simulate thermodynamics with computers. We can simulate water flow. We can do, you know, there's validated models for all of this. We can literally do it. And so it was an attempt to, you know, like the drunk guy looking for his keys under the street light because it's where he can see. It's an attempt to accomplish that part of the work that can be done with computation as we have it, you know, when I was doing the work, but not to try and imply that we were doing more than that. And that was the real struggle of the work. It's a struggle I don't feel is truly resolved in the work, which is part of the reason why I present it the way I do, by saying, well, this is the work, and here are at least a couple of problems with it, but I'm sure you can have more of their own. But the work is trying to point its way towards dealing with, you know, computers and informatics allow us to deal with whole collections of specificities instead of averages in a way that we were never able to before. So it's a way of saying this could be a very important opportunity for architects to move upstream in the design process, to not design. I mean, it would be possible, for example, to design, you know, to take this a little bit further, to say design a prefabricated housing assembly line that would in which each prefabricated house would be aware of the latitude and longitude and landscape and slope of where it was going, and arrange in a digitally inflected construction process, arrange the louvers and orientations so as to generate and not use use the least energy and generate the most energy in any individual site. We're probably 15 years away from doing that. And yet, as a profession, we're not thinking about those opportunities. We're not thinking about how, only 2% of buildings, by some definitions, actually are designed by an architect for the place in which they go in the world. And I guess part of the larger background to this work is the understanding, well, we're never going to get an architect hired individually to design each building on each localized place. But the digitization of the process, along with making a whole bunch of ways architects used to think about the world, in some ways obsolete, also opens up very important opportunities for design, but have to be thought of more broadly and have to be thought of with a deep understanding of what computers are actually good at, as well as a deep understanding of what they're really crap at, right? And of the differences between the two. So that's where that Alexander quote comes in. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but yeah. Okay, you've all been super, super, super patient, and I'm going to dinner with this guy, so I'll get his question later. Thank you so much.